Welcome to Ideas in Action, the official University of Southern California podcast. This show was recorded live on USC's campus.
More than 20 years after 9/11, Muslims in the United States continue to wrestle with its impact and its legacy. Indeed, in both public and political spheres, they have been profiled as threats to national security, as victims of hate crimes, as targets of torture and war, and as a community to be included in diversity initiatives. This afternoon, our panel will explore Muslim representation, inclusion, and empowerment in different contexts and domains, including education, politics, and entertainment. And there's no better place to have this conversation than Los Angeles, which is truly one of the great locations for storytelling and myth-making in the world today. There's no better place to have this conversation than right here at the University of Southern California, where we study, interrogate, engage, theorize, and struggle with the world's great challenges. And there's no one better to think about these issues than our extraordinary panel today. The NBA playoffs may be happening, but we've got the All-Stars here today for our panel. And I'm so honored to be able to introduce them to you now. Dr. Shafika Ahmadi is Associate Professor of Clinical Education at the Rossier School of Education and the Co-Director for USC's Center for Education, Identity, and Social Justice. She is an expert on diversity and legal protection of underrepresented students, including female Muslims, and is the co-editor of Islamophobia in Higher Education, Combating Discrimination and Creating Understanding by Stylus Press. She'll be signing the book upstairs after our panel. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shafika Ahmadi. We have Dr. Maitha Al-Hassan, who holds a PhD in American Studies and Ethnicity from USC, so she's coming home this afternoon. She is the writer of the report Haqq in Hollywood, Illuminating 100 Years of Muslim Tropes and How to Transform Them. And she is the producer and writer of the Golden Globe and Peabody winning Hulu series, Romney. Please join me in welcoming back to her academic home, Dr. Al-Hassan. Dr. Evelyn Al-Soltani is the author of Broken, The Failed Promise of Muslim Inclusion and Arabs and Muslims in the Media, Race and Representation After 9/11. Her book, Broken, was released just a few months ago by New York University Press, and we'll be selling it. She'll be signing it upstairs after our event. She is an Associate Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity here at USC and has served as a consultant for Hollywood studios and also co-authored the Obaidi Al-Soltani test with criteria to help Hollywood improve representations of Muslims. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Evelyn Al-Soltani. And Dr. Hajar Yazida is Assistant Professor of Sociology, Faculty Affiliate of the Equity Research Institute, and a 2022-23 Ford Foundation Fellow at the USC Dornsife School of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. She is an expert on the racial politics of inclusion and exclusion, and she is the author of The Struggle for the People's King, How Politics Transforms the Memory of the Civil Rights Movement. It's going to be released by Princeton University Press next month, but today, for the very first time, it's going to be available upstairs after our panel. She saw her book for the first time just 20 minutes ago. Yesterday was her birthday, so it's a nice way to celebrate the birth of her book. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Yazdihi. The format of the panel this afternoon will be as follows. I'll ask each of the panelists a few questions, then we'll open it up for a larger Q&A with everyone here. After this panel, you can meet the panelists. I encourage you to buy copies of their books for yourself and for your 12 or 15 best friends. They will be right above us upstairs afterwards, and they will stick around and memorialize and personalize every book that you purchased today. So we're really excited to get started. All right. Great. May, we're going to start with you. So, May, this panel is about Muslim inclusion and empowerment from higher education to Hollywood. And that's really been the story of your life as a scholar, a journalist, a television writer, a producer. When I knew you as a doctoral student here at USC, you were different than any other doctoral student I'd ever met in my career because you regularly appeared on CNN, The Young Turks, HuffPost Live, The Fusion Network, and other mainstream media outlets. What was it like being one of the only Muslim American women on network television in front of the camera reporting on the news? And what has your example meant for other Muslim American journalists? What have they told you who are trying to tell new stories about identity, about inclusion, about belonging.
Thank you for that. Oh, is this?
It should be live.
Okay. Can you all hear me? No. Okay. How about now? Oh, there it is. Okay. Perfect. I thought I knew how a mic sounded. Hi, folks. Assalamu alaikum. Marhaba. Thank you for that question, Varun. Varun has been a long-time mentor ever since I stepped foot here. I think we actually started the same year, right? Yeah. And that was quite a journey to have come from being a journalist to sitting down and kind of being infantilized as a doctoral student. I actually had to not tell anybody that I was flying out to DC to host a show for 300 million people globally and then go back to TAing courses. It was, you can ask me about that a little bit later. But so during that time period, I want you to kind of remember this atmosphere without you guys doing the math of how old I might have been. So 2001, there was this movement from people in the Muslim community to diverge from the traditional professional job roles that we had laid in front of us. And we know that's doctors, engineering, lawyers. And some of us asked why we weren't in the world of journalism, because we saw other people speaking for us. And frequently it was national security advisors. It was within the framework of foreign policy, or pathologized us as this like this Muslim mind or Arab mind and Arab brain that was inordinately violent. So interesting enough, we got in through the space of blogs. Do you guys remember blogs? Blogs were a place, and Huffington Post was a blog site that people turned to before Twitter, and now I guess we're kind of going back with Substack, and people are craving longer discussions about the things we're witnessing in front of our eyes and with expert opinion. So from blogs came me co-hosting a View-like show on Arab television called What's Happening? It was very low production, but that set the stage for being on Al Jazeera and the Young Turks and CNN. And it was interesting because I didn't think much of it, but I was part of this class and crew of the new school of Arabs. There were Arab Americans who had to pass as white frequently in newsrooms, and others who, weren't even allowed through the pipeline. And so this new school of folks, I had people who were in journalism school who interviewed me as their models and mentors for what they wanted to be. This is like 2007, 2008. And to me, that was mind-blowing, especially now because some of them are like directors of NPR offices and have committed to that route and journey. I think we still have a long way to go, too. We still see a place in journalism and media where people are, I know this sounds very trivial, but people are still being forced to straighten their hair. I was told I had to straighten my hair or put it up if I was going to be in front of TV. So that is still an indication that broadcast is a very narrow space. We have made it through writing, but broadcast, the idea of the trusted, objective, neutral voice, is still old white man. And we have a world to go.
Thank you for that. Evelyn, just like May, so much of your life, your work has focused on both higher education and Hollywood. And what we've seen over the last decade is really an exponential rise in diversity, equity, and inclusion resources and positions across both higher education and Hollywood. And I think the intention is to create opportunities for individuals and communities that might have previously been excluded or marginalized or disenfranchised. But in your new book, Broken, The Failed Promise of Muslim Inclusion, you argue that many of these inclusivity initiatives not only fail at achieving their goals, but they can sometimes have an antithetical impact of perpetuating the structural systems and mindsets they seek to dismantle. How do you define Muslim inclusivity, and how have DEI initiatives failed?
Thank you, Varun. And I want to acknowledge Varun for moderating, all of you for being here, and I'm so excited to be on this panel with my esteemed co-panelists. So my book, Broken: The Failed Promise of Muslim Inclusion, looks at the process through which Muslims have come to be included in diversity politics. This is something relatively recent and new. And what I found is that Muslims are now included in diversity initiatives because of Islamophobia coming to be recognized as a problem. And we actually didn't use the term Islamophobia after 9/11. It took us about a decade later to start using that term. My first book that came out in 2012, I don't use the term Islamophobia once, and the book is about representations of Arabs and Muslims in the media and the racialization process, but this term Islamophobia entered the US lexicon in the 2010s, and through a series of instances, hate crimes, policies like the Muslim ban, the US public, at least some of them, have come to recognize Islamophobia as a serious social and political problem. And through that process, Muslims have come to be included in diversity. There's a whole other history of diversity also on the rise, while affirmative action is on the decline, and all of these forces colliding. But my book argues that Muslims come to be included through what I term crisis diversity. And crisis diversity is when a crisis moment takes place that exposes longstanding racism. So, for example, Muslim ban will be a good example of this. This brought to many people's attention that Islamophobia is a problem, and then there was a lot of action. People went on the streets protesting. Corporations issued statements against the Muslim ban. Universities started creating prayer spaces for religious Muslim students. Hollywood started portraying Muslims in contexts other than terrorism. But what ends up happening is the crisis moment passes and then attention wanes and we don't pay attention to the problem until the next crisis. And I argue that this is the case for all marginalized groups, but my book looks at the case of Muslims in particular. And I have a criticism of it, which is what Varun is pointing to here, the failure of inclusion, but it also comes with visibility. So there is more visibility. We're seeing Muslim women in hijab in advertising. We have Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, the first Muslim women in Congress. So crisis diversity does give things. It gave us Rami. It gave us Mo. It gave us these TV shows that would not have been possible before. But the example I'll use to point to the failure is Hollywood's response was extraordinary because Trump was a galvanizing figure. And people have been organizing Hollywood to please stop representing Muslims as terrorists for decades. But it was this moment that really led to a shift. And so when I think about that moment, the real crisis is a 100-year history of marginalizing people and misrepresenting them, underrepresenting and misrepresenting. The Muslim ban is just a moment. That is not the crisis. The crisis, so in my opinion, looking at Hollywood, there has been a lot of good that has come out of that moment, but to truly create longstanding change, the orientation needs to change to the root of the problem, the history, and repairing that history as opposed to only responding to that particular crisis.
Shafiqa, we're here on one of the great university campuses in the world, and we know that what happens in the world also happens on campus. In your book, Islamophobia in Higher Education, you highlight unique challenges that Muslim students face on college campuses across the nation. More than just encountering religious and cultural bias on campus, Muslim students also face state-sponsored action targeting them, like Evelyn had talked about. The Muslim ban is the most egregious example, which negatively impacted more than 200 students right here at USC. In your research, you spoke with many, many Muslim students about their experiences, perspectives, identities, communities on campus, challenges, opportunities. What did you learn about the Islamophobic challenges that students face on campus, both inside and outside the classroom?
Okay. See, faculty are not often in front of panels like this, and don't get nervous. Well, first of all, I am delighted to be here with my co-panelists, phenomenal women, fierce women who do the hard work of conducting the research and writing, all while balancing life, professional life, as well as personal life. So thanks, Varun, for moderating, and thank you all for being here. Second, I'd like to acknowledge my co-editor, Professor Darnell Cole, who's sitting right there. He co-edited the book, Islamophobia in Higher Education, Combating Discrimination and Creating Understanding. So thanks for being a partner in this endeavor, Darnell. Look, Islamophobia is nothing new, right? I mean, I have been conducting research on Islamophobia in higher education for over 20 years. While we like to think about the Muslim ban or the recent, the rhetoric, political rhetoric from the Trump administration or others in the political life, Islamophobia has been around long before 9/11. In fact, the first piece that I wrote and I conducted research on was on Muslim women and why they wear hijab and how they were treated on college campuses. With that, and then came the Patriot, obviously 9/11, and the Patriot Act that was, passed in October, just a couple of months after 9/11, also had a negative impact on Muslim students in higher education. So with that, in really thinking about where we are today, we've taught about Muslim students in various ways. And in the research for our book, as well as other articles and other pieces that we've conducted in our center, we've also found that Islamophobia, or the irrational fear of Muslims in higher education, is very prevalent. In fact, Muslim students are often marginalized, excluded from classroom discussions, from group work in the classroom, and are often questioned by their faculty members as to why, in particular Muslim women, why do they wear hijab? If they're wearing hijab, they often become the spokesperson for their communities. They're just like any other regular student, but yet because of their hijab or because of their religious identity, Muslim students are often looked at as the spokespeople and are marginalized. And some examples from the students that we've received are in our studies are faculty members who marginalized students. And one particular example is a student who said, my professor thought that I was a threat to my peers in the classroom because I voiced my opinions on issues of Islam and Muslim communities. And they were actually asked if they were a terrorist in the classroom, in a classroom discussion. Now imagine being a student in a class and getting that type of a question from your faculty member, from the professor who's supposed to create a safe environment for all of the students. And then when they complain, so these are some of the in-class examples or experiences of Muslim students in classes, which then leads to out-of-the-classroom experiences of when they do complain to administrators. First of all, they don't feel comfortable, but for those students who feel a little comfortable and they do complain, often there's no response from administrators from the universities. And when and if there's a response, it's patronizing, condescending, and really also marginalizing those students. So it just becomes this issue of, do they feel like they belong on college campuses? And more often than not, they don't feel like they belong, nor do they feel like they matter on college campuses. Additionally, when we think about DEI issues, as you all are mentioning, while we know that diversity, equity, and inclusion are important and essential, Muslims are often the afterthought. And they're brought into already formed committees where they become tokenized, and they are the sole voice to represent a whole community of Muslims that come from various backgrounds. Now, we know Muslim students are not a monolithic group. They come from various backgrounds, religious backgrounds, gender identity expression, racial, ethnic backgrounds, but none of that matters because, well, at the end of the day, they're just Muslim. And those are some of the issues that we see, inside as well as outside of the classroom, where students feel, one example or another example is queer Muslims, where they live on the margins and they live on the intersections of identities where they feel like their religious identity, their queer identity are not accepted at various areas or spaces that they navigate on college campuses. So overall, it's a lot. So for our Muslim students, their experiences are generally marginalization.
Thank you, Shafiqa. Hajar, your work focuses on inclusive, not just on inclusive structures, resources, and policies, but also inclusive ways of thinking about and understanding history. So much of our collective thinking about inclusion is future-oriented, but in your hot-off-the-press book, The Struggle for the People's King, you look at the past and argue that the ways people revise and reinterpret the civil rights era ultimately fractures our collective understanding of who we are and where we're going. Given that history is his story in many ways, is it possible to reclaim a history that is inclusive? And what does that mean for Muslim American history?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And also, thank you all for being here. This is such a thrill. I feel like I just kind of got dropped on this panel with these superstars. So I'm kind of fangirling myself up here.
Superstar as well.
All right. I'm like, thanks, girl. So, I think for me, when we're thinking about these questions about inclusion and representation, it's so important to root them in a history and a longer trajectory. And in the case of the US, thinking about questions of inclusion is really inseparable from thinking about the struggle for Black freedom, from the civil rights movement. And so this is something that, I really take up in the book, is thinking about how these histories of Black struggle shape the way that groups like Muslims are mobilizing. One thing we do know is that, since the civil rights era, all sorts of groups, including immigrants, women, LGBTQ coalitions, have used the memories and the tools of the civil rights movement to mobilize for inclusion. And so in a lot of ways, it really seems like a kind of ready-made natural strategy. If you're vying for inclusion, you'll draw on that which came before, that which was successful, which in this case is the civil rights movement. But one of the things I find is, I trace the history and the invocations of civil rights memory from 1980 to 2020. And what's really jarring is that since the 1980s, it's been predominantly white, right-wing social movements that are invoking the memory of the civil rights movement, remaking it, claiming it as their own. And they're doing it to claim that they are the new minorities under threat. And so when you have this new landscape, Muslim Americans, which are one of the groups that I study in the book, have to mobilize against this shifting context. They have to contend with this new reality where they can't use the old tools. They have to re-envision and rethink about how they're using the past. So what I find is that, especially in the wake of 9/11, as many of us have talked about on this panel, or thinking about the kind of shift that results where Muslims are being homogenized under this umbrella, as if their diverse histories don't matter, as if they are sort of a solid, singular security threat. And Muslim organizers start using the memory of the civil rights movement to create a new sense of conscience of Muslim Americans. And so it becomes this really powerful tool for giving them a sort of sense of political will and political agency. And it also gives them something to confront, which is the sort of ugly anti-Blackness that exists in so many Muslim immigrant communities. They really have to contend with this and think about how the history of Muslims in the US is rooted in Black history. So in a lot of ways, it really becomes this powerful tool for bringing Muslims together, connecting them with Black Muslims and Black Americans more generally. It helps them build coalitions. And one thing I will say, though, is, a tension that arises in these organizing efforts is that there is a significant difference between, sort of strategically deploying civil rights memory to claim that a group is like Black, and then on the other hand, embodying linked fate, really embodying a sincere connection to other humans, to actually advance justice for Black communities, to acknowledge that the past is not past for Black communities. And so this is something that comes up a lot and that Muslim organizers are continually contending with. And I think the last thing I'll say on this is, this sort of expansion of collective memory ends up being not just a tool for kind of reimagining who Muslims are in America. It also ends up being a way to rethink our very conceptions of belonging and thinking about belonging as something that doesn't have to be predicated on assimilating into whiteness, assimilating into a white supremacist telling of history.
Thank you so much for that. I want to leave time for Q&A, but I have a question for each of the panelists, so I'm going to move into sort of a lightning round here and maybe ask a 2 to 3 minute response. I'm going to go back to you, Evelyn. As a scholar, you've thought deeply about how to translate theories, perspectives, approaches into real opportunities to get better. And alongside your colleague, Sue Obeidi, who is the director of the Hollywood Bureau of the Muslim Public Affairs Council, you created the Obeidi al-Sultani test that analyzes whether film and television projects represent Muslim characters, identities, and stories in nuanced, diverse, and authentic ways. What is this test, and how might content producers engage it as they think about narrative possibilities?
Thank you. So I actually brought these that I will pass out, Obeidi al-Sultani test postcards. But going back to this Muslim ban moment, I should note that, as I mentioned before, that there was a lot of protest from Muslim and Arab American communities before 9/11 to change representations, but it wasn't until the Muslim ban that there was an actual concerted institutional response. And I was talking to my colleague, Sue Obeidi, and we were saying, hey, you know, did you see this show the other day? There have been all these Muslims popping up in TV shows. There's Dr. Qadri, a Muslim woman who wears the hijab on Grey's Anatomy. On Orange is the New Black, there's a black prison inmate, Alison Abdullah. Hey, did you see on The Bold Type, there's the first lesbian Muslim on network television. There were dozens of suddenly Muslims in contexts having nothing to do with terrorism. And then at the same time, we would say, oh, yeah, but, you know, did you see Lone Star 911? This is such an amazing character. There's this woman. She's a firefighter. She wears the hijab. Amazing character. But, yeah, in one scene, her hijab falls off and her hair is blowing in the wind. And, you know, why do they have to go back and do that? Or look at Aladdin. And actually, Matha and I consulted on Aladdin, and my colleague Sue did also. We're like, okay, they finally got it right with casting. They didn't whitewash the cast, but it's still an Orientalist film.
Because they brought us in pretty late, though.
Yes, we consulting in quotation marks, not in reality. But we were noticing there are changes, but they're not going far enough. And so in my book, I refer to this as the diversity compromise, which is recognizing some efforts that are being made by Hollywood to change representations, to correct misrepresentation, underrepresentation, but often it's only partial and not complete. And so Sue and I came up with a test. We were inspired by other tests. There's a Bechdel test for women that says you need to have two women talking to each other about anything other than a man. To highlight, you know, how women have been portrayed in Hollywood for so long, there is a Duvernay test for racial representation, an Isla test for Native American representation, a Russo test for LGBTQ representation, et cetera. And there is a Muslim test called the Riz test out of the UK that highlights terrorism, oppression of women. Our test is coming in at a different register. It's basically saying, we see you trying, and we want to help you do better. So it has 5 criteria. I won't mention all of them because of time, but I will pass these out. But let's just take the first one, for example. It says the project that includes a Muslim character does not reproduce or reinvent old tropes, but rather explores new stories and contexts. So that's trying to say, instead of remaking Aladdin, there are 2 billion Muslims in the world. There are so many stories to explore, and we don't need to redo the terrorism stories. There's a lot of redoing terrorism stories, but it's more complex, and you get the backstory of the terrorists. There's so many stories out there to explore, so it's trying to highlight that, point it out. So it's a test to help Hollywood improve representations of Muslims in this diversity moment.
May, you write for one of the most highly acclaimed television shows right now, Rami, which I imagine scores also very highly on the Obeidi al-Sultani test, and which tells a Muslim American story in a way that we've never seen before. As part of this panel, we're arguing that representation matters not just in front of the camera, but also in the writer's room. What is the writing process like in Rami? Who's in the room, and how might that be different than other projects that you've been involved with or seen?
Yeah, I do want to take a moment. It definitely was a show that emerged out of a crisis sort of response. And Rami was having these conversations the moment Trump had said we need a Muslim registry. So 2015, 2016, there were upsurges in trying to shift the narrative through, or recognizing that they might be complicit in the ways that Trump's rhetoric could have mobilized a certain response. And then, of course, the Muslim ban itself was another sort of moment. So Rami created a model, an ecosystem of Muslims within a writer's room that hadn't previously existed on any other show that I know of. And he did it without much of a background, not being a big movie star, not having a huge pedigree. He hardly had any comedy online. He just did Stephen Colbert, and that went viral. And he was on a Nick at Night show with Scott Baio, you know? So his commitment to saying, I want to do this spiritually right, and I want to take a path of bringing in the people that I know that are part of my community and ones that I know will make this show better, was a decision he made that a lot of people waver in the process because they're pressured to make those concessions, because they're told this is the green light to get to the other end of the door. So he brought some of his friends who, a lot of people who he had to fight for who had no previous credits, right? Including me. He brought me in as a creative advisor in the first season, and being the typical academic nerd that I was, I said, what are the themes that you are interested in exploring this season? Let me make you a syllabus. So we had a syllabus, and every week we read things, books, articles that related to what he wanted to explore. And in fact, an episode about 9/11 called Strawberries came from an article I gave him about the IMF taking over strawberry fields in Egypt. So he had this sort of precision around storytelling that was remarkable, and I would go as far to say was really exceptional, not just for a Muslim writer's room, but for any writer's room, for the level of detail that he wanted to have. And then he brought me on as a writer and a writer-producer the following seasons. And to be able, and this is the last thing I would say, to be in a room where the majority of folks are Muslim, our characters are predominantly Arab, have women, to be able to bounce off of each other, those ideas, is a different kind of starting point. And it also is refreshing to be able to ground your vision of the world, your POV, with other peers who are experiencing things either in a similar way, or because we aren't the same people, we aren't singular voices, can have disagreements in that room about what it means to be a Muslim. And we frequently did, which you saw in the diversity of characters that we have. If you have a whole show about Muslims, you can have many different Muslims, not just one Muslim character that has to be the sole voice of being a Muslim.
Hajar, I 20 years ago was at UCLA studying critical race theory with Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality. I certainly couldn't have predicted, and maybe she couldn't have predicted, that in 20 years, critical race theory would be front and center of national elections, right in the zeitgeist, right in the culture wars. What is your assessment over how the debate over critical race studies, critical race theory, will be understood by future historians who look back on this moment? How might it be contested, co-opted, challenged, and what might that mean for Arab and Muslim Americans, many of whom argue they've been effectively racialized after 9/11 in America?
Yeah, thanks for that question. By the way, the fact that you took a class with Kimberly Crenshaw.
She's my mentor, so
I'm so
I'm a
jealous.
lucky person.
Well, you have to connect me. Yeah, one of the things that I think about a lot in the book is this idea that there's so much evidence when you actually look back, and the sort of invocations of civil rights memory, the revisionist histories that I'm tracing in the book, they really lay the stage for this present moment. It is not unexpected. It has been a long time coming. And I think what's interesting is if you think about what lies underneath these sort of battles, these culture wars, it's the idea that critical thinking rests on understanding the present through the past. And so if you distort the past, if you can muddy it, if you can sanitize it, whitewash it, then you can evade social reality. And that's really the political project that's taking place, is the understanding that the story of the past holds so much power for the direction of the future. And so one of the things that comes up, especially, thinking about like Muslim Americans, thinking about other racialized groups and their trajectories in this context, is that the battle against critical theory is really trying to make us feel like we don't have any agency, like this is what we've been given. If we misunderstand it, then we don't have the capacity or the intention to change things. This is very much what the philosopher Charles W. Mills calls an epistemology of ignorance. And this is an ignorance that's willfully built. It is a strategy, it's intentional, and it changes the way that we see the world so that it's not just that we're polarized in our political beliefs, it's that we're polarized in our conceptions of social reality. So we're actually living on different planes. And what happens when you're living on different planes is that you can't even see each other. So, one of the things that I think about is, where do we go from here? Like, this is not a problem that has a kind of easy set of policy solutions that can extract us from this social reality. But, one of the things that I think about as a social movement scholar is that social change is very rarely linear. A lot of times we go backwards before we go forwards. And so, that's one of the things that we have to hold and think about. And as I was researching the book, one of the most inspiring things that really gave me some hope and also some guidance is that we should look to the grounded knowledge of the Black communities that have actually been fighting this unequal system for centuries. So when we look at this grounded knowledge, it tells us that when we come together in community across our differences, as we see with Black and Muslim coalitions, for example, we really do have the capacity to garner the political power to resist revisionist histories, to fight the politics that motivate them. And another thing is, I was looking at intersectional feminist grassroots movements, and they have these really powerful ways of remaking and reclaiming history where they're writing back in the invisibilized Black women, the queer and the trans activists who were so pivotal in paving the way for civil rights movements. I also look at the Reclaim King movement, which is another really great movement that's been reclaiming King's radical legacy and really trying to take it into a new age, finish its unfinished work, and connect it to global human rights struggles. So I think, finally, I would say one of the big things that we should take away from the legacies of the civil rights movement, especially as we're sort of contending with this culture war, several of them, in fact, is that the civil rights legacies tell us that a critical education and a spiritual education can be transformative. So a critical experience within this larger trajectory, this longer history, and that can be a lifeline that can connect us to one another across borders and boundaries and time. And spiritual education, which I think often sort of goes unnoticed, undiscussed, is pivotal. It's really critical for connecting us not just to one another as human beings, but also to the natural world and beyond. It activates our sense of morality, our commitments to one another as members of the beloved community, as part of the Ummah. And so, I think the last thing I'll say is there's a Dr. King quote that I think is so good for illustrating the power of critical thinking and sort of where we ought to go from here. Dr. King says, the difference between a dreamer and a visionary is that a dreamer has his eyes closed and a visionary has his eyes open. We ought to open our eyes.
Thank you. One last question before we go to Q&A. Shafiqa, I want to bring this back to where we started, right here at the University of Southern California. In your book, you focus on the many challenges of Islamophobia in higher education, and you highlight how higher education can sometimes be part of the problem. Can higher education also be part of the solution to Islamophobia? And if so, how? And what gives you hope?
Yeah, that's a great question. Absolutely. I think higher education could absolutely be part of the solution. And in fact, none of what we're talking about could be done. The critical thinking, this is where it happens on college campuses, right? When we talk about freedom, when we talk about civil rights, this is where it happened. Colleges, universities, where students think about these issues critically. And so, I think institutions of higher education should be at the forefront of addressing and preventing Islamophobia. And really, not just in the classrooms, not just with faculty, but really nationally and globally to really, think about how do we think of issues from a broader perspective? How do we think about issues from not just a critical thinking part of it, that's just a part of it, but what do we do next? What are the actions that we can take? So some things that we talk about in the book, some of the, what often happens is when we talk about addressing and supporting Muslim students, higher education often thinks about, leaders in higher education often think about, oh, well, we're providing halal food, we have a, prayer space, we have, religious accommodations that we're providing. But what doesn't happen is professional development training that needs to happen at a higher level. A few weeks ago, I did a training for a prominent university in the East Coast where I trained 220 of their upper administration, provosts, deans, faculty, and others, because they realized that the issue wasn't just to appease the Muslim students and bring in, a speaker, do a little bit of diversity training. They really thought, you know what, we need to start at the top. We need to make sure that faculty know what they're doing in the classroom. We need to know what the provost, what policies and practices are there for us to address. So that's one thing. Something else that's really important in higher education, especially today, is mental health services that needs to be provided for Muslim students from a culturally and religiously supportive perspective. One of the students in one of our studies talked about his experience getting mental health support, and they were struggling a little bit about with their gender identity. And when they went to the therapist at the school, what happened was the counselor, rather than speaking with the student and really supporting them, they said, it's not that you're confused about your gender identity, it's more that you're confused about your religion. So, those are the practices that we need to address in higher education, and really, making sure that we provide wraparound services for our students, not just halal food, not just prayer space, but really the support and services that they need. For example, Stanford University has the Markaz Center. Markaz Center has dedicated staff members, full-time staff members, as well as students who work there. They provide fellowships for their students. They have mental health services that are specific to Muslim students at their university. They also do a little bit of advocacy and supporting Muslim students at the center. So that's really important to be able to not just appease the students who are coming and complaining about their in-class experiences, but also to make sure that their other needs are also addressed.
Thank you. We have some time for questions and answers. I want to ask as many questions as we can. You can ask questions to the panel as a whole or to any individual member of the panel. Please just introduce yourself when you ask the question, and please wait for the microphone so others can hear you. So who wants to start us off with a question, comment, observation, vignette? Right here in the front. I like your shirt.
Brave soul.
Thank you. I want to thank you all. I'm a graduate student at Cal Poly in Pomona, and I was brought along by a good friend of mine here. And I wanted to ask you about the relationship between your own personal leadership, academic leadership, and your, I guess, position within your families as a woman, taking leadership and speaking, and how that relates to the patriarchy that we all experience. And are there tensions? And how has your critical education and your spiritual education sort of prepared you to step up and conceive of freedom for your communities alongside others?
Okay. That's so funny. I was just talking about the fact my father is an alum from Cal Poly Pomona, and he had such a great experience. He tried to pressure all six of us to go. I was the one of the lone wolves that didn't go, but what happened was, so I grew up in a city called West Covina, which is close by, and my father was a small businessman, but he was very active in local political races. So he took us to city council meetings. He took us to phone banking, canvassing with like Dolores Huerta. It was predominantly more Latinx community. And he took me to political fundraisers and any event, and we did protests as well. So any event he took me to, I was this like 8-year-old kid who was very interested, was a dancer. My mom used to sew me sequin outfits, just like you. And I would show up in these belly dancing sequin outfits at these political fundraisers. And my dad would introduce me as his future congresswoman. And although I was just there to dance, I think what it ended up doing for me was during a time, this is pre-9/11, when the only available image to me was Jasmine from Aladdin, this cartoon. It gave me this vision of something more, a kind of political imaginary that wasn't possible with what the media environment was offering me. And I knew that I didn't want to be within the halls of dominant power, but I wanted to be a check on dominant power. And I think that's been my trajectory from journalism to academia to media to building up social movement organizations in the Muslim and Arab community as well.
I'll go back to my dad, too. My dad was very invested in me having an education. He did not have a college degree. I was the first person in my family to get a college degree, and he was very, very insistent on higher education. My brother dropped out of college. It was a disaster in the family. And so even though I was totally alienated my first year in college, and I wanted to drop out like my brother did, he joined a band. That was so cool. I wanted to do that. I stuck it out because I couldn't disappoint him. And it led me to women's studies and ethnic studies. When I got to college, he said he would only pay for economics. He wanted me to be a lawyer or go to business school. So it was a bit of a struggle, but I went all the way to the PhD, not in business or law, but in ethnic studies. And I've been driven my entire academic career to figure out how to talk about Arabs and Muslims in relation to race in the United States. Because when I was growing up, we got all these questions all the time about where we're from and all kinds of assumptions about my dad and his background. And he changed his name for a while from Kamal to Ken. And I was just confused as a kid. Why is this happening? Why is he doing this? And when I got to college and I finally found my footing, I really wanted to learn this about me. And I was telling Varun the other day in a meeting that at the time you went to Middle East studies to learn about Arabs, and you went to religious studies to learn about Islam, and you couldn't learn these things in the US context. And so that was driving me for most of my academic career. And then after 9/11 happened, there was an opening where there was a public recognition, oh yeah, Arabs and Muslims are racialized, and I became part of a cohort of scholars who started studying this and bringing it into the field.
So I'll start with law school. In law school, I graduated at the top of my class. However, and I had a job. I want to make sure I say that. In law school, if you are at the top of your class, you don't go to them. They come to you and they recruit you, and you get a job. I had a job before, on my third year of law school, but I graduated in 2002, right after 9/11, and all of a sudden there was no vacancy for me. I was a junior attorney coming into the law firm, and my contract was rescinded. Wow. Now, I knew what it was about, but I couldn't really do anything about it. So for me, that's where it started, where I really started thinking about not just my Muslim identity and my last name as Ahmadi. I spent the next year in Milwaukee. I graduated from Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, law school, and we were living in Milwaukee, where I spent a whole year trying to find a job. Again, I graduated at the top of my class. I couldn't find a job. I went to an interview after networking at a major law firm in Milwaukee. And during the interview, actually during lunchtime, which was kind of an off time, but not really, because it's really you're on the whole time for the interview, a senior partner at the law firm was at that lunch, and he looked at me and he said, Miss Amadi, what brings you to Milwaukee? Now, remember, I'm from Seattle, Washington. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, went to school in Indiana, now I'm in Milwaukee. Now, his question is great, right? Because he wants to know that if he's going to invest, his firm is going to invest in me, I'm going to stay, I'm not going to leave. That's a lot of money that they invest in an attorney. So that's an excellent question. For me, because I didn't have roots in Milwaukee, I said, well, my partner lives here in Milwaukee, and he's a faculty member at Marquette University. In fact, we recently got married. Now, those are the things you don't say at interviews, but I had to because I needed to establish roots. And he looked at me and he said, have you thought about changing your last name? Now, I studied employment discrimination. So, again, I looked at him and I knew what was happening, and I said, I needed a job. So I said, you know what? I haven't really thought about it. In fact, I had. Darnell Cole, who's my husband, who's in the audience, had asked me if I would change my last name, and I said, yes, as long as you change your last name. That was the end of that conversation. So long story short, after this interview, as I was driving home, I thought about what happened during this interview, and I said, wow, I just got discriminated against based on my sex, gender, and religion. So they offered me the job. Of course they did. They didn't want to get sued because they would have a case. They offered me the job, and I said, thank you, but no thank you, because I don't want to be in a position where you can offer me the job now, but you're going to continue to ask questions, to wonder if I'm going to be a good attorney for your law firm, and if I'm going to be too Muslim for you, too female, too woman, whatever your two is. So I said no to that, but that propelled me to work at the Hawaii Civil Rights Commission, where I investigated civil rights violations. So I ended up being at a better place anyway. Lived in Hawaii for 3 years.
Thank you. Yeah.
I love that question because for me, origin stories are everything. So thank you. I'll try to go quickly. So I am the daughter of Iranian refugees, and they left after the revolution. They were major political activists. And so actually, that shaped me 100%. They were staunch feminists, maybe to a fault. Like, it was a lot. But you know what? They always believed, I have a sister, they always believed their girls could do anything, and they would fight anyone who told anybody otherwise. And so being raised in that way had a significant impact on me. And I mean, this is also my parents being like Marxists, and they were raised Muslim in Iran, and they became atheists. So we were raised, with sort of some spirituality, but no organized religion. And I do think in a lot of ways that shapes not only the way that I think about my research, but it's the way I approach literally everything in life, is always that the human comes first. It's never about sort of the boundaries around like a race or a class or sex or nationality, which doesn't mean that I don't see color like that. Yeah, I'm like, we're not doing that here. But, I do think it is always the question that's sort of at the center of the work that I do, and the way that I work with students is what is the sort of the core human issue that's going on here as we relate to each other as social beings.
I'm going to take a page from Hajar's example and quote Martin Luther King to end us here, who said that our lives begin to end the day we stop talking about things that matter. Our panelists have spent their lives and their careers talking about things that matter. I hope that they have inspired you to do the same. And we're going to continue to talk about things that matter upstairs at the book signing, and where you can meet the panelists, buy their books, talk about things that matter, get them signed, and get them gifted. So I please ask you to join us immediately after this upstairs. I am so, so grateful to our extraordinary panelists today. Please join me in thanking Dr. Hajar Yazdiha, Dr. Evelyn Al-Sultani, Dr. Mehta Al-Hassan, Dr. Shafiqa Ahmadi. So grateful to all of you for being here. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day at the LA Times Festival of Books. Be safe. Fight on, everyone.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast and visit us at podcast.usc.edu.